Welcome to the Head of the Breach podcast, where we talk everything offensive security. I'm your host, Casey Cammilleri, and today we're recording live at Black Hat and DEF CON. With me, I have Nikita Belikov. Colonel Nikita Belikov is currently the Director of Staff for the Nevada Air National Guard and previously was the Director of Cyber Operations. He has been working with the Air Force and National Guard for over 25 years and has worked with cyber and red team roles for over 20 years. In recent years, Nikita has run mission-tailored teams to replicate threats in exercises on cyber ranges and production network environments. Nikita, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks, Casey. I'm a fan of the podcast. It's a true pleasure to make it.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we can talk all sorts of crazy cool things, and you can educate our audience. And one thing I think we need to be mindful is that, everything that you discuss today is going to be your own opinions
Yes.
and not affiliated in any way. But maybe let's start off the conversation with what keeps you up at night? What would be some of the threats that would keep you up at night?
Yeah, it's almost too many things to think about. But you could get into situations.
So you never sleep.
Oh, right. Yes. No. Concerned by paralysis by overly concerned about everything. But you can't do that. That's impractical. So you focus on some of the things that some of the most vexing problems that I think that we have, and we as a community, and the military is not immune to this. On the cybersecurity side, we fixate on things that are sort of glamorous and cool, the latest exploit, the latest 0 day, the latest tool framework. But, for when you consider the worst case scenario, when a adversarial nation state is starting to escalate tensions or move towards combat operations and starts to progress in that continuum, as a cyber professional, a lot of my number one concern would be some of those malicious privileged insiders that a intelligence service would then put into play if they truly were moving towards that all-out conflict. And so in the spaces that we typically think are secure, in the cyber secure spaces, whether it be SCIFs, classified facilities, whether it would be flight lines, maintenance hangars where our fourth and fifth generation fighters are being maintained and getting ready to get launched, it's not beyond the pale to consider that an adversarial state would put insiders at or near some of those spaces in order to then disrupt our ability and limit our readiness and blind us at the most inopportune moment to create those degrading effects.
Yeah. Now, there's, I'm wondering, your type of background, how did you even get into cyber operations? You've been in the military for 25 years, right? What does that look like, that background, that progression to where you are today?
I'd love to tell you that this was an elaborate and well thought out game plan where this was my dream all along. But, I started in the military, spent 4 years at the Air Force Academy. I get commissioned as a second lieutenant in 2003. And my journey actually started with tactical communications. My first assignment was in Korea, and the responsibility was to provide secondary communications off the peninsula via SATCOM terminals should the primary start to fail. You think about undersea cables. The Republic of Korea, South Korea is one of the most wired country there was. But again, thinking about the worst case scenarios, and if North Korean operatives would start to sever some of those connections, we were the backup pipe. I then went to Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama City, Florida, and was part of the squadron that ran the base network. So, typical IP-based network, some airfield systems. From there, went to school with the Marines, went back to a tactical communications role, and then really it wasn't until about 7 years into my career where I was sent to an assignment at Fort Meade and started to do things on the defensive side, led a team of analysts at the top of the DoD security stack, so the gateways, just complete gobs of data that comes in and out of that, and so we were trying to make heads or tails of that. And then after that assignment is when I went to the 57th Information Aggressor Squadron, the Air Force Red Team, and so that's probably the deepest dive into how I got in what we traditionally consider cyber operations.
The aggressor team. Can you explain what that is and what your day-to-day is like?
So the aggressors have a very long history here at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas. But after Vietnam, the Air Force had realized that some of their fighter pilots weren't quite as ready for combat sorties early on in the war, and we took unnecessarily high casualties. One of the lessons learned was that they were not getting the realistic training that they needed to get. As a result, there were resourcing decisions that were made, and there were squadrons of what were called aggressors that were stood up in the Pacific, in Europe, and Alaska, continental United States, in order to provide those really good professional adversary capabilities for training exercises. These were folks that were sent to these assignments, and their primary role, what we called, is to know, teach, and replicate the threat. So first, you really have to dig into the intelligence and figure out not just that the Chinese fly the flanker, but how do they employ it? When do they get good? And so you are first figuring out the threat via the intelligence analysis that you're doing and just memory. Then you're teaching the threat. So to be able to then, in a fairly concise manner, teach those tactics and teach those employment scenarios based on ground truth intelligence. You're not making this up. This is all grounded in the intelligence. You're teaching it. And then the third bit, which by that point kind of becomes the almost less the easiest part, is to replicate, and that's just go out and execute. And so these squadrons of aggressors were stood up, and we had several. We had 2 aggressor squadrons here. And then in 2007, the Air Force made a choice to stand up the Space Aggressor Squadron in Colorado Springs. They were part of our group. And then the Information Aggressor Squadron, which was the cyber aggressors, the Air Force Red Team, along with the air aggressors and air defense aggressors. And the air defense guys are the ground-to-air electronic warfare and surface-to-air missile squadrons that present that integrated air defense look for the flying missions. And so we were, to my knowledge, in 2007, when the Adversary Tactics Group stood up, we were the first and only all-professional aggressor task force, multi-domain aggressors in the world to be able to do that. And so our understanding of the cyber domain and how we replicate that threat always comes from the context of being part of a multi-domain red team and not just cyber for cyber's sake type conversation.
Can you talk a little bit more about that multi-domain? Because I think that's important takeaway for us to understand.
Yeah, and so we again, basing things on intelligence and some assumptions, we could say that our pilots aren't going to go into the fight all alone. Likewise, the adversary states are going to bring all domain capabilities into the fight: space, cyber, information operations, electronic warfare, all bundled with the kinetics that we're used to: the missiles, the ships, the planes, everything that goes into a normal fight. And so that's our primary presentation model as we come forward is, in that compressed time period, usually about a 3-hour window where blue is vulnerable to a red attack. We would attempt to progress through an entire campaign and time our effects in order to put our multi-domain aggressor brothers and sisters at the best advantage, just to show them. So if we're in a command and control operations center environment, we would then take the most critical information and try to predictively figure out what blue is going to do in every other domain. So that if we steal that plan and we hand it over to our other aggressor friends, and they know exactly where the planes are going, they know exactly what the objectives are. If we could potentially blind some of the visibility aspects of what blue is trying to do at the right possible moment, or the wrong possible moment as is for them, then we would attempt to do that using cyber to then create effects in other domains, so that ultimately Blue learns that it's not. They have a really tough task, first of all, because 3 hours is not a long period of time to figure out what's happening in the cyber domain, especially as quickly as we move through those networks. But they have to realize that, just shutting off our accesses or just trying to hunt us down and figure us out where we are in order to interdict us as the cyber aggressors, they have to understand that there are effects that will ripple throughout the other domains. And so those defenders learn that they're not just there to defend a network, they're there to defend an entire operation from us.
Now, is it difficult to kind of like train and practice in that multi-domain? Because I could just think of so many different campaigns or scenarios going so many different ways that, like, how do you get the multi-domains, tight and working? It's
a pretty everything done in the military, both on the blue and the red side, is done through either a 48 or 72-hour planning cycle. And just as, so we don't arbitrarily launch planes. There's always got to be objectives. There's tasks to achieve those objectives in a time-bound and objective-centric. There's usually a scenario that's driving you to say, okay, we've got to take out these targets, and we have to defend for those. But it's done through mission planning, and that combined red task force mission plans together to figure out the timing and tempo of what we're trying to achieve, or anticipate what blue is going to do, and then those red effects then have to be timed with everything that's happening. So there's not going to be a direct translation of an effect. So if we shut something down, no airplanes are going to fall out of the sky. The cyber is a little bit isolated, and we have to have a little bit of manual translation, as in there's got to be human beings that say, okay, this happened on the network, so this is the translation effect in the other domains. Because real world risk is real world risk. You're talking about hundreds of, several dozen aircraft that are flying around, American pilots, coalition pilots, and for cyber to take something down would be like irreversibly.
Like GPS goes down.
Yes, we couldn't afford that. We can't. That's a level of risk that's unacceptable, even in a high stakes exercise like Red Flag that we would have. But you would then within the right risk parameters, you would try to time it and create it, and what's happening in the other domains because you're in those planning sessions with your counterparts, and then within that time space and geographic region, you try to achieve it to the best that you can.
Interesting. What do you believe is the a nation state attacker technique that us civilians are probably not prepared for?
I would say some of the discoveries that are most interesting, that I think are really vexing, again, outside of that privileged insider, because that's very hard to ferret out and involves cyber counterintelligence. But let's say from the technical perspective, what I think is an underserved space, and it's the reason that it is because it's very challenging, and it's stuff that if you have an inject, let's say very low into a stack down at the firmware level, and you start to get privileged access at the firmware level, and then you start to gain control further up the stack, it's very difficult to detect that origin. Where is this coming from? Those firmware attacks, to me, are some of the most interesting and some of the most vexing to catch, in my opinion.
So that could be like supply chain, right? Even though supply chain, so we get laptops with compromised firmware already, right? And,
sure.
Yeah,
that's a threat vector you could talk about. I think a couple of other instances too is a lot of the times so for example, some of the manufacturers create remote management capabilities for the firmware portion of their component. Now this is done with the best intentions in mind to then, not have to send an admin out to some space or do something. You can reach out something remotely, but you could just imagine how that could be compromised and used for nefarious purposes. And because there's so little detection at that level, if it's compromised remotely, then it's just like any other cyber attack chain that you would be confronting.
Yeah. And would that be something that you guys would plan and prepare for?
I think if we didn't, I think we would be doing a disservice to the blue counterparts in whatever scenario you could see.
Yeah. I mean, you've worked on everything, from securing, F-35s to, power grids. What are some of the things you've learned in doing that?
I think one of the more interesting instances was when we were in charge and running the large opposition forces team for exercise cyber flags. So U.S. Cybercom runs several cyber flags in any given year, but there's usually a bigger one where they invite hundreds and hundreds, dozens of teams, hundreds of defenders into a large space and sets up massive virtual networks. And planning for that, months and months of planning that took place leading up to it, one of our demands, this was 2017 going to 2018, the Russian attacks in the Ukraine had just played out. You had the sequential December attacks 2015, 2016. So we had used those as this inspiration in building our campaign plan. But for that, we needed an ICS SCADA component into those virtual environments. Mm-hmm. And in the planning process, what we encountered was so much reticence against the blue defenders, taking place in the ICS SCADA environment. There was this kind of a comfort zone within IT enterprise environments, Windows, maybe a little bit of Linux, people are comfortable in. Once you start moving away into some of the more exotic environments and you start to get into some of the weird protocols and data flows and traffic scenarios, then people start to think, well, I don't operate in those spaces. And as a forcing function, we had teams back out that didn't want to participate. Of the ones that did, ultimately when we executed the campaign and we had assistance from some of the best national lab engineers to help us build those environments. And so they created these amazing representative ICS SCADA environments. And when we were done with that campaign, we would, this was a 8-day exercise. At the end of each day, we would disclose a little bit of what we did. We would at least help defenders to say, we would sit down with them and kind of debrief. This was a nightly hot wash. We couldn't give them everything because, once you kind of zero in on the implant, the C2 framework, it's not hard to signature us across. But we would validate some of their assumptions. So they would at least get oriented, because if they're lost in day one, there's no way they're going to catch us on day 8. So it would have been completely wasted training. But by that last day, when we made our way in from the IT environment, came across the DMZ, got into the ICS SCADA, the light bulbs going off in the defenders, understanding that, hey, this isn't that complicated. The ICS SCADA environments and that the reticence and the hesitation earlier on to participate, because I think they didn't want to look bad. Nobody wants to look bad in front of their commanders or in any of those scenarios. But the way that we kind of took them on that ride and built that trust with them to show them that, like, hey, we're not here to make you look bad. We're kind of your instructors. We're taking you. You're observing us. You're trying to get ahead of us. But even if you don't, you get to see this traffic flow in your sensors, in your logs. And some of them were successful. Some of them were successful in preventing from us launching that final exploit to replicate the, I want to say Black Energy, which was, I think, the tool suite that the Russians used. So we had kind of a thing that looked sort of like it, and to give them a look. And some of them got ahead of us. But even the ones that didn't, on that last day, we disclosed absolutely everything. So we had our operators run through behind the terminal, ran through the entire 8 days of campaign. They watched us do it, and even more of that disclosure. And I think what was initially just way outside of everybody's comfort zone created some outsized learning that I don't think that they would have gotten in any other scenarios there.
That's really interesting. I kind of correlate that exactly to like what we do to help protect businesses. Is it's always sometimes a red team versus blue team, and no blue team wants to look bad, as no team wants to look bad or incompetent. But really, if you change mindsets to be like, no, we're both here to learn, that purple teaming kind of aspect, right? Then like both teams benefit and we all benefit.
Yeah, absolutely right. As I talked about the heritage of the aggressors, exercise red flag has been around for 50 years. Literally, this is the 50-year anniversary this year. And so that domain is very mature. The pilots, in a formation, you could have, a captain who's in charge, and you have a colonel flying in that formation. And if the colonel makes a mistake and they find out in that debrief, you could see the culture there is that you make the mistake, you own up to it, and then because the idea is that everybody learns from everybody's mistakes. We would rather learn in training and rank agnostic debriefs where we're very cognizant of rank in just about every other scenario except for the post-mission debrief. And so that's the culture. We have adopted that at the 57th Information Aggressors, and have carried that into every debrief that we've done with the blue teams. We're a younger domain, and even in my time here at Nellis Air Force Base, I have seen a maturation where what in the mid-2000s was very adversarial, and nobody wanted to tell you, hey, we saw you, we didn't. That now it's a lot more transparent, and people realize that we're here to teach, not here to make them look bad.
Yeah, I think that's something we could take away, I'm going to take away into our own practices, which is like, yes, we have different org structure and authority, in a typical business, but, even our development team, like we go through retros, like what worked with this sprint, what didn't work, what can we learn from, right? And just learning from everyone's mistakes is an opportunity that we can reflect on and take away, and it should present itself much more often in business.
And it's very powerful. It's very powerful when you have somebody of rank and consequence stand up, raise their hand, and say, "This was my mistake." Because we would, one of your folks in, Topher Lyons, one of your teammates who was my teammate at the Aggressors, was fantastic at this. He was an absolute all-star at, figuring out true root causes of something going wrong. There's a gazillion contributing factors, but digging down to true root causes, and there's usually it's, either your plan was garbage, or you have your plan, you have your decision, and you have your execution, right? So either the plan is bad, then the whole thing goes badly. But a bad plan executed violently and quickly could rescue a bad plan. You can have a great plan, you could make some bad decisions, have a bad sight picture, you think you see something that isn't the way that it's seen, you make a decision off of that, then everything goes sideways. You can have a great plan, you can gather a really good sight picture, and then you can execute it poorly, then everything falls apart. And it's usually those three things, and Topher was just fantastic at distilling those root causes and then highlighting them. And when the root cause is somebody who is high ranking and it's their judgment mistake that drives that, it's very powerful when they stand up and show by example
the accountability.
That I am just as susceptible to making mistakes, in that operations and that execution time frame. Everybody's, like I said, rank agnostic, blameless. We're just all here to learn. That's a great example to set. So if you guys are in those scenarios, it might be worth encouraging some of the high-level leaders just to open the floodgates, because when that happens, everybody sees that there is, true learning happening, and even the person in charge is taking accountability. I think that sets a really positive example.
Now, how are the geopolitical landscape and the turbulence, how's that all affecting, the work that you're doing, the planning, and how we civilians should be thinking about this space from a cyber perspective?
I think as now I'm part of the National Guard, I'm several years removed away from the aggressor mission, which was arguably the most fun I had in the Air Force. Inarguably, I'll say it was
Sounds
great.
pretty fun.
It was awesome. But now, as our concerns, if I'm part of the Nevada Air National Guard, one of the concerning issues I see coming from as a result of the various typhoons, between Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, and an adversary trying to gain in Salt Typhoon what I'll call the ultimate high ground in national level communications, when they are sitting in our telecoms and are able to really pick and choose that, collectively speaking, if they're even on classified reporting of almost double digits in various companies, and they have that real-time visibility of who's talking to whom and where people are. Some of those big concerns certainly make me uneasy because as somebody who would have, I think that knowing what that level of visibility gives you of traffic flows and sitting in telecoms and cell networks, I think that that's very, very concerning. They probably, in terms of pinpointing where our leadership is, in terms of pinpointing movements of capabilities and military units, that would probably give them a huge advantage. And then the Volt Typhoon part, the critical infrastructure piece, the mantra that came out of the FBI reporting was that this is pre-positioning. Whether they wanted to be discovered or they wanted to wait until the time was right then to inflict those effects, they certainly had pervasive accesses throughout the critical infrastructure.
Interesting. So what are, how does that change the preparation for that? Do we need to think about differently how we prepare and plan?
Yes, I think, from the technical aspect, of course, ideally, if you start talking about utilities that are, I want to say, 70, 80, 85% owned by private ownership, they're not owned by the government. And so in order to, they have very thin profit margins and not a lot of space to create these exquisite defenses in order to stop somebody like a dedicated adversary like Volt Typhoon. The thing, of course, that we can do is, one, I'm going to shamelessly plug the reserve component of our military. So the Army and the Air National Guard present a great capability for our senior defense authorities to be able to plug us in order to fill in the gap potentially. Again, still the conversation needs to take place between government and private leadership to say for guardsmen to walk into those spaces and maybe augment existing defenders. So I'll just assume if those authorities in a perfect world are knocked out of the way and then guardsmen are there. But I think the Guard present a cost-effective opportunity with a lot of expertise. I'm a full-time guardsman. I work Monday through Friday. I'm in uniform, but 80% of the National Guard is part-time, 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. They're trained. So that means they have real jobs. Unlike me, they have real jobs. And those jobs are in those industries. They're in the utilities. They have private cybersecurity employment. So they have that expertise. And as that surge augmentation force, they offer that X factor, I think, to our leadership to be able to leverage us in order to deterrence is hard, but at least to degrade some of the effectiveness of somebody like a Volt Typhoon actor, to be able to get ahead of them. It would have been nice if we had pre-positioned the Guard a year or two ago, and then, depending on what you read in the Volt Typhoon timeline, maybe that would have been too late. It would have been nice to have that perfect intelligence, but there's no better time like the present. And I think the more choices we make towards maximizing everything we have, which includes the reserve component like the National Guard, the better off we'll be. The second piece I'll say is that, if our timelines and the intelligence is valid and there is genuinely, a push by, people of Republic of China to, take Taiwan, as it were, we can just anticipate that Volt Typhoon may have been just a fraction of what we discovered, and that our critical infrastructure to some degree is going to be negatively affected when that plays out. And the second thing I'll say is that if that happens, a lot of this is going to be a play on our emotions. The whole point will be to affect the national public, the mood, to then say, to make Americans think that it's not worth it. It's not worth it for the United States Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, and the Army to defend Taiwan if this is the cost. If we're going to have pervasive power outages, if we're going to have some other critical infrastructure disruptions. So the point will be, it will have limited military value, but it'll have a kind of an information operations value to then collectively degrade the motivation of the American public in order to back that campaign. And so what I would say is that if we're ready for that emotionally now, when we build in the resilience, maybe a lot of manual controls, because that's what happened in Ukraine when Russians started to remotely shut off the power in December. They sent out a bunch of engineers and to reset the infrastructure, ultimately got it back. And so for us to get ready as a country that could be a potential outcome of what may play out, and then as an industry for us to build in the resilience that overcomes some of those remote effects, then I think that it's a very non-glamorous solution. It's non-technical, and again, as a cybersecurity professional, I would love to have a technical fix for it. But I think this is kind of a national conversation and a national preparation effort that needs to take place.
Yeah, and so we need to bring more awareness to that. But even if we are aware, do you think we'll we'll be ready to handle that emotionally, right? Or will we just fall back to emotions, I should say, and just we'll make poor decisions.
I think it's a risk that whoever's behind Volt Typhoon, PRC, if it is, it is, I think, has been attributed in the unclassified space to be a Chinese actor. What the worst case scenario for us is that, of course, it degrades our public's motivation to back a military campaign to defend Taiwan. But they may also overplay their hand, and it may galvanize our effort. It may, piss us all off and make us even more motivated to defend Taiwan and defend our national interests in the Pacific. And so I would like to think that that's the way that I would prefer that Americans would react. But I don't think anybody saw, once the pandemic broke out, for example, that toilet paper would be the first thing to go.
Right.
So I think it's going to be a very unpredictable time. But I'd like to think that collectively, eventually, we would rally around that to say that, you can't get away with that. You can't take the fight to our homeland and then think that you can get away with that. Of course, we're going to back a military response. That's what I would prefer would play out. What I actually prefer would play out is nothing would play out. What I would prefer is that cooler heads prevail, that China doesn't move towards Taiwan, and we exist in this competition deterrent state, and which is tensions are better than actual combat in terms of the loss that it would incur. So that's actually my preference. But if push comes to shove, I would prefer that patriotic unified response.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and unfortunately we can't keep going, but if someone wanted to connect with you, how could they do so?
Primarily I'm on LinkedIn, Nikita Belikov, probably one of the only ones that is in Nevada on LinkedIn, but yeah, that'd be my preferred way to connect with me.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, Nikita.
Thanks, Casey.
If you've made it this far, do me a favor and check out what we do at Sprocket Security. If you're ever in need of a penetration test and you want that hybrid scalable approach, the always testing, always on, not this fake click a button, do a pen test 2 weeks and then do that 5 times a year. No, I mean always on, always testing, latest bleeding edge threat that comes out there, latest exploit, phishing, all the way to, defense evading, covert operations, whatever type of pen test you need. We'll do it as frequently as possible, and we'll also provide a platform for us to interact together. I've devoted the last 5 years of my life to building penetration testing and innovating upon it and changing it so you can actually do security testing, proactive security testing, in a much better way. Give it a shot. Check us out, www.sprocketsecurity.com.